I'm Wes and welcome to GAK Vision. Today we're going to be talking about the Gibson Custom True Historic series of guitars. Here I've got a couple of 59s and also this is a Historic Select which I'll go into a bit later on. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the Gibson Custom branch, they're a separate division from the USA factory based in Nashville. Now, for those of you that are familiar with them, you'll know them for their Gibson Les Paul Customs, the R series of guitars, so you've got the reissue 56 gold top with the P90s, 57 gold top with the humbuckers, and then the 3 burst guitars, so you've got the 58, 59 and the 60. Gibson Custom also are famed for arch top guitars and also full-on custom builds, so it's kind of like a dream factory, which we can go into on another video. So Gibson Custom have always been known for creating very accurate historic reissues of their guitars. However, there have always been certain things which technology hasn't allowed them to do to make them truly accurate until now, really, until they decided to come up with the True Historic range. So what they've done with the True Historic range is go back to look at how the processes were done in the 50s, in the factory, the timbers that they used, the plastics that were used, the glue that they used, and they've tried to incorporate that into these new series of guitars to make them as historically accurate as possible. So let me run through some of the things on the guitars which are new and what makes them stand out from the old reissue series guitars. So here we have a 59 model, which is absolutely stunning. This is in the cherry burst colour. Okay, so the processes that were used in the 50s, they had pretty primitive factory equipment, which a lot of it is still used today in the custom factory. However, they have incorporated CNC machinery and also 3D scanning. So that means that they can take an original guitar from the 50s, they can put it into the scanner, they can map every part of the guitar to the nearest thousandth of an inch. They can then program this into the CNC, and then when they carve the guitar, it comes out exactly as the original would have been. Now, the second thing that they did was look at the woods on the guitars. So in the custom shop, they actually select all the woods separately to the USA factory. And all of the mahogany on the guitars, so that would be for the backs and the necks, is all one-piece genuine mahogany. It's grown in Fiji and is closely related to the original mahogany plants that they used, or trees that they used in the 50s. The tops are figured maple. And you will notice on this that it doesn't have your traditional kind of chevron book match finish on there. That's because in the 50s they didn't use book matching, or they very rarely used book matching. What they used was actually called slip matching, which is where they'd take 2 pieces of timber that had similar grain or from the same plank. But instead of opening them like a book that gives you that kind of symmetrical finish, they'd slide them against each other until they find a match of the grain. So this one here is a great example of that. You can see that there's no chevron going on there, and the grain just follows nicely across the guitar, and it makes it really interesting to look at. And that is how the guitars were done in the 50s. The next thing to think about is how they actually carve the guitars. So as I said earlier, they 3D scan the guitars. And previously what they do is they do a carve on the CNC of the top, so you'd get the dishing of the top, and the same on the neck. And then they'd use what's called a slack belt sander to actually go over the top of the guitar, smooth out any of the rough finish that the CNC left behind. Now that doesn't leave an accurate finish compared to the originals because you take away too much material when using the slack belt, and it can change the dishing of the top. So what Gibson decided to do now is do a double carve. So they'll carve it once, they take it off, they check it over, then it goes back on the CNC again, and that leaves quite a smooth finish, which is then finished by hand sanding. And the same goes for the neck. What that leaves you with is an accurate dishing of the top, which would match that of one of the original guitars. Sounds like a small thing, but it really does make a big difference. The other thing that they looked at was the taper of the body. Now you can't see from the side of the guitar the taper because it's so small, but there's actually a taper going from the top to the bottom, which allows them to have a 3-degree route angle when they do the pickup routes, the neck route, and also for the backplate. if you looked at the original guitars and you take the backplate off, you'll see like a slight line where the maple blends into the mahogany on the back. That's because of that taper of the originals. The next thing Gibson decided to do was look at the plastic parts that were used on the guitars. So on the reissue guitars, they've used really good, you know, they look accurate, but in terms of the material that they use, they aren't close to the originals. And this has been a big thing for collectors, always wanting to kind of get that original feel of an old guitar. So what they did is they spent quite a lot of money on buying parts from old 50s guitars that hadn't made it through the years, and they actually chemically analysed these, and they deconstructed them, they cut them up and basically destroyed them so that they could make these parts for you now. So what we've got on the new guitars is a 6-ply ABS pickguard, a 3-ply ABS toggle switch ring, and a 4-ply ABS jack mounting plate. The pickup rings or surrounds are made from butyrate. The knobs are also made from butyrate, and as you can see, they've got a really great gold lustre to them, and this because they're hand painted now. Now these look really close to the originals. The next thing that Gibson looked at was the finish of the guitars. Now previously they've always used a nitrocellulose finish, which is what was used on the original guitars, but this finish is much thinner on these guitars. So this is an unaged version, but the finish is about half the thickness of what they'd use on a standard kind of reissue series guitar. And what Gibson actually did is employ wet hand sanding for this, so it goes as thin as possible. They also employ one guy in the whole factory to just do all of the buffing on these True Historic guitars. And that's because it's such a thin finish, it's so easy to buff through and have to refinish the guitar all over again. So they've actually got one chap that does all of those guitars. Now there are aged versions available of these guitars. The guitars are aged in-house at the Gibson Custom factory, and out of the 800 that they produce a year of the True Historic series, there are 150 that will be done by Tom Murphy, who was the guy who originally aged the reissue series guitars. The others that are done in-house, you know, they are absolutely incredible and don't incur the Tom Murphy upcharge. This finish here is the aged or the vintage cherry. Here we've got the vintage Dartburst, and here we have the vintage lemon as well. The pickups that they use on these are Alnico 3 custom buckers in both the neck and the bridge. The fingerboard has now been rolled on the edges. This is done by hand. This gives a really great feel when you're playing the guitar on the edge of the neck, which makes it more like the originals. And the bodies, something I missed earlier was the hide glue construction, which is quite important. Back in the 50s, hide glue was used for gluing the necks, the bodies and the tops to the backs of the guitars. They've started using this method again because up until recently they've used current, more modern glues on the guitars. But the hide glue, it gives a really thin layer of glue between each piece of timber, which gives great sustain and means that you're going to hear the wood, not the sound of the glue in the guitars. So that combined with the thin finish means you're getting a really resonant instrument. Peghead veneer has been replaced with a holly veneer. Now previously Gibson used was kind of like a plasticky material. It was quite thick as well and already coloured black. These are holly veneers now, and they're the same thickness as the holly veneers were on the original guitars. They're then painted black before they have the inlay set into them. The inlays on the fingerboard are celluloid inlays, which is what we used on the original as well. And on the back of the guitar, you have these True Historic backplates. You do get an original spec one in the case as well if you wanted to take that off and keep the guitar looking as old as possible. You're probably wondering what this absolutely gorgeous top guitar is right here. Now this isn't actually a True Historic guitar. This is a guitar which I spec'd up when I went to visit the factory earlier this year. you can probably see it does have a boot match top on there, which isn't something that you'd get on the True Historic series guitars. I actually went through all of the tops in the factory and hand-picked tops for 5 guitars, which we now have in the store. So feel free to come and try those. The main difference being the top on this, and the backplate says Historic Select as well. Other than that, it's a True Historic spec guitar. When I was in the factory this year, I got to try some of the original 50s guitars that were in being scanned for collector's choice models. And I honestly can say that if I hadn't been able to smell the difference between the guitars of them sitting in an old case for 30 years, then if I'd AB'd them with one of these True Historic guitars, I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference, especially the aged models. They were so good, and I don't know if there's more of a hype about the originals and it's rare that you get to put your hands on them, but I can honestly say that they were so close that, you know, if they smelt the same, I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. So that's enough of me talking about them. Now my colleague Joss is going to go through some of the pickup options on the guitars and give them a bit of a play test. So thanks for tuning in to GAK Vision. I'm Wes. If you want to try any of these guitars out, you can give us a call in the shop on the number below, and you can come and try them in store in one of our new demo booths. Thanks very much.